Night over the Pacific. A carrier deck hums under dim red lights. American gunners stand silent at their stations, eyes forward, not upward. Radar screens flicker. Somewhere above the clouds, Japanese aircraft close in fast. No shouting, no searching the sky, just calm, calculated aim. And when the enemy dives, the guns speak first. If you're watching, make sure to subscribe for more real World War II history told exactly as it happened. In the early years of the Pacific War, the skies belonged to Japan. From December 1941 through mid-1942, Japanese naval aviation was considered among the most disciplined and lethal air arms in the world. Their pilots were battle-hardened from years of combat in China, trained in long-range navigation and aggressive attack tactics, and supported by aircraft that emphasized agility and striking power over protection. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, fast and responsive, seemed almost alive in the hands of an experienced pilot. The Americans feared its silhouette long before they fully understood its vulnerabilities. When Japanese carrier groups swept across the Pacific, they moved like precise instruments of destruction. Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, the sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse, the destruction at the Philippines and Java. These victories carved a reputation of Japanese air dominance. To sailors and soldiers on the ground, Japanese aircraft appeared suddenly, struck with frightening coordination, and vanished into the clouds before defenders could respond. American anti-aircraft defenses in 1941 and early 1942 reflected a different era of warfare. The U.S. Navy's primary defense against incoming aircraft was visual spotting. Crews scanned the horizon and sky with the naked eye or binoculars, calling out positions, altitudes, bearings, and speeds. Gunfire was reactive, rushed, and often inaccurate. Even well-trained gunners relied on lead estimation and instinct, not data. Every engagement was a gamble, and in those opening years, the odds favored the attacker. On the sea, a carrier under attack was a vulnerable giant. Dive bombers could appear from cloud cover, plunging from near-silent heights. Torpedo bombers skimmed just above the waves, using the ocean surface itself as concealment. And because Japanese formations trained to approach in coordinated layers, American defenses were often overwhelmed. The sky might hold a high-altitude bomber, a downward-plunging dive bomber, and a near-sea-level torpedo bomber, all within seconds of impact. Even when defenders fired effectively, the technical limits of their tools worked against them. Anti-aircraft shells required direct hits or almost impossibly close timing. Fuses had to be set manually by crew members on deck, who judged altitude and trigger times under pressure. A few seconds too long, and the shell detonated harmlessly past the target. Too short, and it exploded before reaching it. Hitting a moving plane required predicting its future position, a calculation unfolding in fractions of a second. Meanwhile, Japanese pilots had been taught to view American gunners as slower, less experienced, less precise. Early reports coming back to Japanese carriers reinforced this belief. Japanese crews claimed they were able to press attack runs with limited losses against American task forces. The success of early war raids created an image of Japanese aircraft as nearly untouchable in their approach. But behind this imbalance, something was changing. American commanders understood that the problem was not the bravery of their crews, it was the system itself. If a gunner needed to see an aircraft to fire on it, then the aircraft always had the advantage. If fuses were manual, timing would always lag reality. If reaction defined defense, then the initiative always belonged to the attacker. In early 1942, teams of engineers, mathematicians, naval officers, and radar specialists began working toward a single, transformative idea. What if the defenders didn't need to see the enemy at all? What if the location could be measured instead of guessed? What if future aircraft positions could be calculated automatically? What if shells could detonate near a target on their own? Unknown to the Japanese, the U.S. Navy was moving rapidly toward a new kind of warfare, one where data replaced instinct, electronics replaced eyesight, and where the sky itself could be mapped, predicted, and defended with terrifying efficiency. And the first signs of this change began on the decks of American ships, quietly, without fanfare, while the war still seemed uncertain. The moment when Japanese aircrews first discovered this new American capability would change the balance of the Pacific Air War forever. And it would happen faster than they expected. The transformation would begin with the Navy's technological overhaul. The shift began in shipyards, laboratories, and training schools rather than on the battlefield. The U.S. Navy recognized that the age of visual warfare was ending. Aircraft moved too fast. Attack windows were too short. Human perception alone could no longer protect a fleet. So, the Navy reorganized its defensive philosophy from the deck up. First came radar, crude by modern standards, revolutionary for its time. These early sets, like the CXM and later SC and SK systems, were bulky, temperamental, and required teams of specialists to maintain. Yet they did something that no pair of eyes could do. They saw over the horizon. They detected aircraft long before engines could be heard. Operators could watch formations approach in the dark, through clouds, or beyond the visible sky. At first, radar simply bought time. Time to sound general quarters. Time to get gunners to their stations. Time to launch fighter screens. But there was still a problem. Early gunnery remained a manual, human-driven response. Radar could tell a ship where planes were, but guns still relied on guesswork to hit them. This led to the second transformation: integrated fire control. The U.S. Navy introduced the Mark 37 fire control system, a combination of director optics, stabilized mounts, and, most importantly, a mechanical analog computer known as the Ford Mech WW2. This device took range, altitude, bearing, speed, and movement data and calculated in real time where a moving aircraft would be seconds later. It produced continuous firing solutions, constantly adjusting gun angle and elevation automatically. This meant American gun crews no longer needed to track aircraft manually with their eyes. The system itself predicted flight paths. When paired with radar input, the Navy had effectively given its anti-aircraft guns a form of digital sight. Sight that never blinked, never hesitated, and never looked away. Alongside this came a third evolution: layered anti-aircraft defense. Instead of each ship fighting alone, task forces began coordinating fire zones. Destroyers created outer defensive rings. Cruisers formed inner shields. Carriers remained at the center. Every ship had assigned sectors, preventing gaps and reducing confusion under attack. The sky above an American fleet slowly turned into overlapping spheres of fire, ordered instead of frantic. But technology meant little if crews could not operate it effectively. So, the Navy added something Japan could not easily match: standardized, large-scale training. American gun crews trained relentlessly. Drills ran day and night, loading, aiming, firing, clearing, repeating. Crews learned to operate silent, to trust instruments over instinct. They practiced under simulated stress: alarms, smoke, vibration, shouted orders, movement under fire. Every motion was refined until muscle memory replaced thought. Meanwhile, Japanese naval aviation faced a growing crisis. Their air arm had relied on an elite corps of highly trained pilots. But as the war expanded, their losses mounted faster than replacements could be trained. Japan's pilot schools emphasized lengthy, perfection-driven instruction. Graduating a single aviator took years. The war did not allow years anymore. By late 1943, Japan began shortening pilot training, sending younger, less experienced crews into combat. They faced American defenses that were becoming more precise, more automated, and more coordinated. The same pilots who once dove with confidence now returned with reports of alarming accuracy. Something was different. American gunners weren't tracking planes visually anymore. They were firing before the aircraft completed its approach. It felt impossible, invisible, almost mechanical. But the most shocking development was still ahead, because even the best calculations could fail if the shell itself needed a direct hit. The final leap would be a fuse, small, enough to hold in one hand, yet powerful enough to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. A fuse that could sense its target, a fuse that detonated at the perfect moment, a fuse that removed guesswork entirely. The breakthrough arrived in the form of something deceptively small. Not a new ship, not a new cannon, but a device that fit in the palm of a hand. The variable time fuse, better known as the VT proximity fuse. Before its introduction, anti-aircraft fire was a contest of timing. A shell had to be set to explode at the precise instant it reached the aircraft's altitude. Crews worked fast, adjusting fuses by hand. A second too early or too late meant the explosion bloomed harmlessly in empty sky. Even when a shell passed close to an aircraft, it often failed to inflict fatal damage unless the fragments struck critical structure. Hit. Probability depended on perfection under pressure, AAB, nearly impossible demand. The proximity fuse changed everything. This new fuse contained a miniature radio transmitter and receiver. When the round was fired, it emitted a weak radio signal. If the signal bounced back strongly, meaning the shell was suddenly near something solid, the fuse detonated automatically. It didn't need a direct hit. It only needed closeness. A near miss was now often just as effective as a hit. It turned the sky around Japanese aircraft into lethal space. A bomber could fly through a barrage, never actually touched by an incoming shell, and still lose a wing, a tail, or control surfaces. The air around it had become charged with invisible danger. The Japanese would not understand the mechanism for months, and even then, they underestimated how deeply it was integrated into American defense. But the fuse alone didn't shift the balance. It needed two additional elements: a system to calculate where the aircraft would be, and a gun crew trained to trust that calculation. This is where the Mark 37 fire control system fully came into its purpose. The Mark 37 wasn't just a sighting device. It was a command center for anti-air warfare. The director, a turret-like structure, tracked targets using both radar input and optical feeds. Data funneled into the Ford Mk1A analog computer below decks. This machine was not electronic, it was mechanical. Rotating gears, cams, dials, and shafts performed real-time trigonometric predictions. It was robust, shock-resistant, and astonishingly precise. When the system locked onto a target, it continuously calculated aircraft speed, angle of approach, future flight position, wind influence, ship pitch and roll, gun recoil compensation. The system predicted where the aircraft would be, not where it was. The guns adjusted themselves accordingly. When linked to radar, the system gained something pilots did not expect: awareness without vision. The American crew did not need to see the aircraft. They simply waited for the bearing and range to stabilize. Then, with calm precision, they fired. This is what Japanese pilots noticed first. The Americans weren't looking up. There was no frantic searching, no rushed aiming, no shouted bearings. The guns already knew. The layered nature of U.S. firepower magnified the effect. Fleets did not fire randomly. They fired in patterns, interlocking shells bursting in controlled volumes of airspace. Japanese attackers flew into carefully constructed kill zones, not scattered gunfire. The sky itself became a weapon. On a U.S. carrier task force, the outer defense layers used 5-inch 38 caliber guns, firing VT-equipped shells, directed by radar. Inside that, 40mm Bofors batteries tracked targets with powered mounts and mechanical predictors. Closest of all, 20mm Oerlikons created a final wall of steel for any aircraft that broke through. Every range, every altitude, had a weapon designed to dominate it. By contrast, Japanese aircraft were lightly armored. They relied on maneuverability and pilot skill to survive. Against visually aimed gunfire, this made sense. Against predictive, automated, radar-directed fire with proximity fuses, maneuverability meant little. The shell didn't need to hit the aircraft. It only needed to come close. American ship logs from 1943 onward show a steady shift in engagement reports, where early war accounts read, "Opened fire. Enemy aircraft struck after repeated bursts." Late war accounts read, "Enemy aircraft destroyed before attack formation completed descent." The Japanese noticed too. Pilots began returning with the same stunned observation. "The Americans fire before we attack. They know where we will go. They do not look at us. They already know." Some believed the Americans had developed new optical gear. Others thought they had discovered a new type of pilot training. A few suspected, correctly, that radar was being used for fire control. But almost no one understood the fuse. They had no equivalent, no countermeasure, no way to reproduce it quickly. Japan's industrial base was strained. Its electronics manufacturing capacity was limited. The research required to miniaturize electronic detonators under combat conditions was extensive. The United States had spent years refining it in secure labs with vast resources. Japan simply lacked the time and infrastructure to match it. By late 1943, the U.S. Navy had turned preparation into inevitability. Radar detected the approach. The Mark 37 calculated the trajectory. The VT fuse ensured the hit. And the gunners, calm and disciplined, fired without ever looking up. This was not just a shift in technology. It was a shift in the nature of warfare, where the speed of human reaction no longer determined survival. The Japanese would soon experience the full scale of this transformation. In battle, where entire squadrons would vanish into walls of invisible calculation, the shock would be recorded in pilot debriefs, fleet reports, and survivor testimonies. And the world would later remember the moment as one of the clearest turning points in the Pacific Air War. While technology reshaped the battlefield, it was discipline and training that made it lethal. A machine was only as effective as the crew who operated it, and the U.S. Navy understood this better than most nations engaged in the war. Radar, fire control computers, and proximity fuses were transformative tools, but without the human element to maintain them, interpret them, and execute decisions under pressure. They were nothing more than steel and circuitry, so the Navy trained relentlessly. Aboard American warships, life for a gun crew was measured in drills, before dawn, during midday, in the final hours before sleep. Drill, alarm signal, load, traverse, elevate, track, safe, clear, reset, over and over until every movement flowed without hesitation. A gunner didn't think about his role. He didn't consider steps. He simply did them. Precision was not a goal. It was the standard. This constant repetition was not merely about mechanical proficiency. It was psychological preparation for chaos. Anti-air combat was sudden, violent, and unforgiving. The difference between a coordinated defense and a panic-driven collapse could be the difference between a carrier surviving or burning in flames, and the U.S. Navy wanted no collapses. On American ships, every gun mount had a clearly defined chain of command. Fire direction did not come from individual judgment. It came from the Mark 37 director, which itself received range and bearing data from radar. Operators learned to trust the instruments, to act not on instinct, but on system-driven solutions. If the bearing was set, if the angle was calculated, then the gun fired. No hesitation. This was disorienting for new recruits at first. Many grew up around rifles, where shooting required aiming by sight and adjusting by feel. But naval anti-air combat was different. It was math made violent. A gun crew was part of an integrated rhythm of prediction and response, so training evolved to build unity, not just skill. Aboard U.S. carriers and cruisers, gunners practiced silent drills where the only communication was the movement of machinery and the rhythm of footsteps. Commands were internalized, not spoken. The crew became a single organism. If one crew member hesitated, the entire battery suffered. If one loader slipped, the firing cycle faltered. If one spotter misread input, the fire control director lagged. The Navy's trainers were blunt. You do not shoot to scare. You shoot to hit. In contrast, Japanese naval aviation doctrine placed extraordinary value on individual pilot skill. Their pilots were indeed talented, agile, and daring, but the system itself relied on heroism. If a pilot failed to evade fire, the aircraft was lost. If a leader misjudged timing, the formation broke. Japanese air combat doctrine emphasized attack, initiative, and instinct, but did not provide a reliable answer to calculated, large-scale defensive coordination. Where the Japanese trained aces, the U.S. trained systems, and this difference became more pronounced as the war continued. After 1942, Japanese pilot losses accelerated. Each loss represented years of training, experience that could not be replaced quickly. Replacement pilots entering combat in 1944 and 1945 lacked the refined maneuvering discipline of earlier cohorts. Their attacks were often direct, predictable, and easier for radar and fire control calculators to model. Meanwhile, American crews grew sharper with every month at sea. Lessons were shared across fleets. After-action reports turned into revised drills. And most importantly, ships trained together, not individually. Crews learned how to fight as task groups, not isolated vessels. The result was a defensive posture that felt, to Japanese pilots, almost unnatural. They approached. They committed to their attack dive. They expected gunners to follow them with their eyes. But the Americans did not look. Guns rotated with mechanical confidence. Shells burst exactly where aircraft turned, not where they had been. Explosions appeared in patterns, not in guesses. It felt as though the Americans knew their moves beforehand. One pilot, after surviving an attack against a U.S. carrier group during the winter of 1944, described the experience simply. The sky exploded around us before we began our dive. We were seen by something we could not see. That something was the fusion of training, discipline, systems thinking, and technology. This was not luck. It was not instinct. It was preparation so thorough that battle itself became an execution of rehearsed inevitability. But to understand the true shock this inspired in Japanese aircrews, we must now shift to their perspective, their expectations, experiences, and the moment they realized the sky over the Pacific had changed. For Japanese pilots, the Pacific sky of 1941 and 1942 had been a place of confidence. Their training was rigorous, rooted in mastery of aerobatic maneuvering, precision formation flying, and coordinated attack sequences. They were taught that success came from aggression, closing distance rapidly, diving before defenders could respond, striking decisively, and withdrawing before counterfire could become accurate. And in those early months of the war, this doctrine worked. American defenses were slow to respond. Ships fired late. Their accuracy was scattered. The Zero and its pilots seemed untouchable. But as 1943 turned into 1944, reports from frontline air groups began to change. The first signs were subtle. Pilots returned from missions describing gunfire that seemed better timed. More aircraft were damaged during approach, not during exit. Formations that once cut confidently through anti-air belts now suffered sudden losses mid-descent. At first, these incidents were attributed to luck or improved American morale. Then the pattern deepened. Accuracy became consistency. Pilots began noticing something that unnerved them. American gunners were no longer visually tracking them. Dive bombers and torpedo pilots made their approach runs expecting to see heads turn upward and guns manually follow their movement. Instead, they saw gunners at their stations with steady postures, eyes level, movements minimal. The guns moved, but not with the searching, uncertain motions of early war. They moved smoothly, with purpose, following paths that matched aircraft movement precisely, even when clouds concealed them. This was deeply unsettling. For pilots trained to exploit human reaction time, this new American behavior defied logic. Japanese air doctrine relied on creating speed and angle changes faster than a human gunner could predict. But now, the Americans did not need to predict. The system did it for them. Surviving pilots described this shift with uncharacteristic bluntness. They fired before we entered attack range. The explosions appeared in front of us, not behind. They did not look. They simply knew. The psychological impact was profound. The cockpit was already a place of enormous stress. Pilots flew long distances over open ocean, often navigating by dead reckoning, with no guarantee of rescue if their engine failed or their fuel ran low. Every mission demanded both technical precision and emotional discipline. But now, instead of facing uncertain defenses, they faced a system that felt indifferent to human daring. Bravery did not matter. Skill did not matter. The calculation had replaced the contest. In squadron ready rooms aboard carriers like Shokaku, Zuikaku, and later converted training carriers, veterans tried to explain the change to newer pilots. They spoke of invisible detection, of automated gunnery, of shells that burst when they came near, not when they struck. Many younger aviators refused to believe what they heard. They had grown up hearing stories of Japanese superiority in the air. They were told that the Zero's agility and the pilot's instinct were the ultimate weapons. Reality would teach them differently. During mid-1944 carrier operations, especially in the lead-up to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, squadron losses mounted at a pace no air arm could replace. Pilots who had once counted on evasive rolls or high-speed breakaways found these maneuvers predicted and countered. A dive that once made defenders fire too early now merely placed the aircraft into a pre-calculated kill zone. The Japanese command structure tried to counter this shift. Intelligence officers analyzed gun patterns, radio reports, and post-action diagrams. They attempted high-angle approaches, staggered formations, even deceptive climb-and-dive rhythms. None of it stopped the bursts that greeted them in the sky. What unnerved them most was that the American defensive fire did not feel emotional. There was no sense of desperation in it. It was systematic, precise, and constant. It felt like a wall. You could approach it, you could challenge it, but you could not break it. Experienced pilots, those who had survived years of combat, tried to guide their less experienced comrades. They explained how to read shell patterns, how to avoid predictable runs, how to split formations to saturate coverage. But with fewer skilled veterans left and more recruits entering combat with minimal training, the ability to execute complex maneuvers diminished. And so the shock spread, not from individual encounters, but across the entire Japanese Naval Air Force. In briefing rooms, maps were marked with attack routes where squadrons failed to return. Senior flight leaders grew grim. Reports stopped describing American gunners as improving and began describing them as unavoidable. A sense of inevitability took hold. This was not the sky they had trained for. This was not the enemy they believed they understood. The full weight of this realization would strike, hardest in the defining battles of 1944 and 1945, moments when entire air groups launched with determination and skill, only to be dismantled before they reached their targets. The turning point was coming, and it would unfold over the Philippine Sea. The shock became undeniable in June 1944. over a vast stretch of ocean known as the Philippine Sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy launched Operation Ago, a final attempt to turn the war's tide and destroy the U.S. carrier fleets advancing toward the Marianas. Japan committed its remaining trained pilots, its largest carriers, and every available aircraft to the strike. It was a gamble based on assumptions that had once been true, that Japanese air crews were superior, that American defenses were slower to coordinate, and that courage and maneuver would overcome machines. But the sky they rose into was no longer the same sky they had once dominated. At dawn on June 19th, radar aboard American carriers detected the first incoming wave at astonishing distance. Screens flickered, bearings stabilized. Operators relayed calm, precise reports to the combat information centers. The fleet did not scramble blindly. It reacted with practiced choreography. Fighters launched to intercept at high altitude, but it was the ships themselves that delivered the defining response. As the Japanese formations drew nearer, still unseen by the crews on deck, the Mark 37 directors rotated to calculated firing angles. No eyes followed the aircraft. No gunners leaned skyward. Elevation wheels turned with slow confidence. Breeches opened. Rounds slid home. The guns were ready before the attackers crossed the horizon. When the Japanese pilots finally descended through the scattered cloud layers, they saw something deeply unsettling. The Americans were already shooting. Shells burst in predictive clusters, not random sprays. The patterns were unmistakable. The explosions were positioned ahead of the flight path, meeting them in motion, forcing them to fly into walls of shrapnel. To the Japanese aviators, it felt as if the Americans were firing from knowledge of the future. As Zero fighters broke to engage U.S. interceptors, the bomber crews continued forward, driven by doctrine and duty. But the approach path was no longer a battle of nerve and timing. It was a corridor of destruction. Bombers vanished mid-run, their wings sheared or their engines crippled. Those that survived the initial barrage encountered tighter layers of defense. 40mm Bofors mounts tracking automatically. 20mm Oerlikons forming rapid-fire barricades at close range. Wave after wave launched. Wave after wave disintegrated. The Japanese pilots later described the experience with a consistent phrase. It was as if the Americans were not aiming at us. They were aiming at the air we would fly through. That was exactly what they were doing. By the end of the day, the Japanese Navy had lost over 300 aircraft, and, far more importantly, many of the last surviving veterans of the early war. The battle became known to American aviators as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. To Japanese commanders, it marked the collapse of their carrier-based air power as a strategic force. Yet the shock did not end there. The following year, during the Battle of Okinawa, Japan launched one of the most desperate aerial campaigns in history, the wave of kamikaze attacks. These pilots flew with a singular purpose: to strike American ships regardless of survival. They approached low, fast, and directly. They eliminated the need for escape routes, evasive maneuvers, or survival planning. Their aim was impact, not return. If any tactic could have overcome American predictive fire control, this was it. But the same systems that defeated skilled aviators also defeated those who flew without hesitation. Radar detected kamikaze formations well before they reached their attack points. Firing solutions calculated their speed and descent angles automatically. VT fuses detonated shells near approaching aircraft, shredding them before they neared the hulls. Ships that once would have been struck repeatedly now survived wave after wave. There were losses. Kamikaze attacks were violent and unpredictable, but the damage was far less than Japan had hoped. The very tactic meant to bypass human reaction was defeated by machines that did not react, but simply executed. There is a recorded incident aboard the USS Hazelwood, where Japanese survivors were pulled from the water after their aircraft were destroyed during an approach. When questioned, one of the rescued airmen asked repeatedly, "Why did your gunners never look at us?" How did they know where to fire? The answer was not a secret. It was not hidden. It was simply the result of a system Japan could not match in time. Radar saw the approach. The fire control system solved the trajectory. The VT fuse ensured the burst. Training ensured execution. The defenders no longer fought the pilot. They fought physics. This transformation did not just win battles. It changed the psychology of the air war. Japanese pilots understood that bravery could no longer overcome calculation. Instinct could not outmaneuver automation. Agility could not defeat predictive targeting. The Pacific had become the proving ground of a new kind of warfare, one where machines extended human ability beyond natural limits. The pilot of flesh and bone faced a defensive network that was not emotional, not impulsive, not hesitant. It was inevitable. And in the final year of the war, the consequences of that inevitability shaped every engagement in the sky. What happened after these battles reshaped global military doctrine and the future of warfare itself. By the end of 1945, the skies over the Pacific were unrecognizable compared to those of 1941. Japanese naval aviation, once the pride of an empire, had been reduced to scattered formations, hastily trained replacements, and desperate final tactics. The elite corps of pilots that began the war had been lost over the Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomons, the Philippine Sea, and finally, Okinawa. What replaced them could not match the scale or precision of the American system. The United States had not only caught up to its adversary, it had surpassed it through integration of technology, training, and doctrine. The radar-guided, computer-directed, proximity-fused defense network fundamentally changed how air power functioned. It removed uncertainty. It denied surprise. It replaced reaction with prediction. And because of this, it removed the one advantage early Japanese aviation had relied on: initiative. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese carriers still existed in name, but they could no longer project force. Ships without experienced air crews were little more than steel hulls afloat on the ocean. By Okinawa, Japanese commanders increasingly resorted to kamikaze attacks not out of choice, but necessity. The traditional model of air warfare: strike, survive, return, refuel, strike again, was no longer sustainable. Meanwhile, the United States continued expanding its training programs, refining radar systems, and improving fire control coordination. Ships returning stateside for overhaul were upgraded. New carriers, faster, larger, more efficient, rolled off assembly lines at a pace that Japan's wartime industry could not match. American air groups rotated pilots regularly, ensuring combat experience was retained rather than lost. When the war ended, U.S. analysts studied the effects of these technological shifts carefully. Reports noted that the proximity fuse alone increased anti-aircraft effectiveness by nearly 4 to 7 times, depending on conditions. Naval intelligence estimated that without VT fuses and radar-directed gunnery, U.S. fleet losses in 1944-45 would have been dramatically higher, especially at Okinawa, where sailors faced some of the most intense kamikaze waves of the entire conflict. Japanese military records captured after the war showed the psychological weight of this shift as clearly as the strategic one. In the diaries of pilots and officers, one recurring sentiment appears: the Americans have found a way to make machines think. The expression was metaphorical, but not entirely inaccurate. What American systems demonstrated was that warfare had entered a new stage. Victory was no longer determined only by bravery or maneuver or individual skill. It depended on the ability to predict, to analyze, to coordinate, and to execute at scales beyond human reaction time. The lessons extended far beyond the Pacific. In the decades that followed, air defense networks around the world would be designed with the same principles first proven in the skies above the U.S. carrier groups: detect early, predict trajectory, automate response, remove human delay, The Korean War saw radar-directed anti-air systems expanded further. The Cold War accelerated the development of computer-assisted targeting. Modern naval combat systems like Aegis trace their lineage directly back to the Mark 37 and the analog predictors that once turned steel gears in the hulls of wartime destroyers. And yet, at the center of this transformation were not machines alone, but the people who trained with them, gun crews who learned to trust data over instinct, engineers who worked night after night refining circuit stability, radar operators who watched glowing traces on screens while the rest of the ship slept, and officers who believed that war could be fought with precision rather than chance. The Japanese air crews who survived returned home carrying the memory of a sky that no longer belonged to them, not because they lacked courage, not because they lacked skill, but because the nature of war had changed faster than they could adapt. The Pacific War will always be remembered for aircraft carriers, island campaigns, and the clash of two great naval powers. But beneath those sweeping narratives lies a quieter truth. The war was won, in part, by learning how to see the enemy before the enemy ever saw you.